We're going to start right in. First, let's talk just briefly about overarching approach to advocacy. Does one voice make a difference? What's the value of joining a group? What's kind of the higher level way to think about this? And Lucas, if you'll start with that, please.
Sure. So the short answer to your question is absolutely. In fact, just today, I got a call from Senator Deb Fisher's office. I had asked her office to support some particular legislation related to healthcare. I mentioned I work for a healthcare company, and they took the time, 10 minutes to call me back and talk to me about what had just passed in the budget resolution at the end of the year. That's exactly the kind of impact that people don't think they can have, but they can easily have with our members of Congress. And that's true at the national level. It's certainly true at the state and local level. There's a saying in Citizens Climate Lobby and beyond that, if you have one call in a week, you might get a mention in the daily staff meetings. If you've got 2 calls in a week, you're definitely going to get a mention. And if you got 5 calls, that's a major event. So you can definitely have a difference, make a difference as a single person advocating. I also want to just take a little bit of time to mention 2 things in terms of advocacy. And Lori, if you'd like, we can talk about those a little bit more. One is the approach that I believe in, which is to talk to these offices, talk to your elected representatives with respect, appreciation, and gratitude. That's the CCL way. That is a very effective method for communicating with them and convincing people that might not necessarily be on the same page with you to listen to what you have to say. And then the second thing that I'll mention in terms of overall approach to advocacy is I really like the science-driven, results-driven, and people-driven approach of the Environmental Voter Project. So I wanted to mention the Environmental Voter Project specifically. They are an organization dedicated to taking environmental voters, people who are environmentalists, but who don't vote, and getting them to vote consistently in every election. That's a very powerful project. They've done it with 1 million people in the United States already. So if you haven't looked at them, their approach to advocacy is also really powerful. 1 vote does make a big difference.
Great, thank you. Eric, anything you'd like to add to that?
I would obviously agree with everything Lucas just said. For starters, the only additional thing I would say is, as much as you can build relationships ahead of time, and that's not always possible. When you're dealing with federal officials, state officials, or local officials, the closer you get, the easier typically it is to build the relationship. But to Lucas's point, if you're getting an email, a call, or text from somebody at that point you're more likely to do something with it as an elected official. I share this, and I'd also say to use your personal connections. When I started doing this, I was kind of hesitant to try to say who I know or how I'm connected to the person. Now I've done a complete 180. You should always use your personal connections. I see my uncle, I think, is on this call. I use this example. He's from Gothenburg. So I have family in Gothenburg, and you better believe when I'm dealing with a state senator from Gothenburg, I make sure to make that point that my grandparents are from there. My mom grew up there. And so that would be another thing in terms of building relationships. Definitely mention your connections to whoever that elected official may be, in addition to what Lucas said.
Okay. Martha, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, these are all great comments. So I'm a scientist by training, but I do a lot of interaction and talk about climate. And I've joined Citizens Climate Lobby when they have interacted with lawmakers. And what I bring to the table is a trusted science-based voice. And I completely agree with everything that's been said. For me, what has worked best is connecting with the person on common values and figuring out what they care about, establishing trust, building a relationship and fostering that over time, and repeat visits, going back again and again, listening to what they have to say, practicing empathy, even for those that completely disagree with you and have a very different viewpoint, practicing empathy and hearing them out. Sometimes people just want to want to say what's on their mind, even if it's completely opposite of what you think or what you're advocating for, that's okay. Let them and have their time and give their platform, and somehow find something that you can connect with. We're kind of focusing on climate here, but what you may connect with may be outside of climate issues. It could be related to water or health or your faith or your favorite fishing hole or whatever that may be. So connecting is so very important.
Great, thank you. Moving on, let's talk specifically about contacting elected or appointed officials. How do you go about advocating for your position? What message, what medium do you use? How do you frame your messages? Those kinds of things when you want to contact a specific, probably an individual, maybe a body, but a specific individual. So Eric, would you start us off with that, please?
Sure. And this is probably going to be a theme for me. The more you can connect with that individual, the better off you are when advocating your position. So the better you get to know them, the better chance you're going to have to get them to believe in your advocacy position or share your advocacy position. So I always think this is going to be obvious, but an in-person contact is by far the best sort of contact you can have. That can either be over coffee, it can be at the state capitol, whether that's an individual meeting or sending in a note as we do to state senators to come out and talk to them. I think Martha was saying it, but the more there's a back and forth and you're listening to what that elected official may be saying, or they're listening to what you're saying, it's very different than if I'm writing a letter or sending an email. Not that that's not valuable, because I'll hit on that in a second. So that's, I'm stating the obvious. The more you can get to know that person or talk to them in person, the better relationship you'll build and the better chance you have advocating your position. Next would probably be emails. Actually are very effective. I think Lucas hit on this, but elected officials really do care what their constituents think, and they really want to hear that. And I've seen examples where elected officials are, say, apathetic on an issue, and they literally will count the number of emails they got for and the number of emails they got against. And so if you don't have the time, or something has just come up that day, you don't have the time to make it to the Capitol to request a meeting, emails are very effective. Same with phone calls. Again, a lot of the state Senate offices we deal with, they do track the number of phone calls, number of emails. And if you are within that district, so hopefully a good majority of you know who your senator is. If not, I'd encourage you to look up who your city council representative, state senator is. If you're a constituent, you rise above some of the others. So if you're within the district, you get extra credit, I guess. And then I think Lucas is going to talk some on social media. Depending on the age or how engaged the senator or the elected official is on social media, that can actually be a pretty effective format. I'll use Senator Adam, or he's about to be term limited, Senator Adam Moorfeld, very active on social media. And so it's realistic to think if I'm tweeting at him, he will actually take into account what I'm saying. The only other thing I'd say, and Martha has talked about this a little bit, is to meet the elected official where they are and think through kind of what makes them tick. Maybe if you know about their background, what arguments would work with an elected official based on their background, whether that be their job, where they're from originally. So to think through that before you talk with them. But if there's anything else, or if you don't listen to anything else I say, I promise that elected officials really do want to hear from individuals. I think there's kind of a perception, maybe more so nationally, that elected officials don't care what their constituents think. I have found the exact opposite. There have been situations where elected officials really want to know what constituents think, and it can be that how they decide how to vote. So those are a few of my thoughts on that, I guess.
Eric, if a person has never done this before, so they're feeling a little nervous, or they're shy or introverted or whatever, what's the least scary way to contact an elected official if you've not done that?
Sure, it's probably emailing. And again, I would encourage you to email to ask if they're willing to set up coffee or meet briefly with you. Feel free to bring a friend. So, I see we have 57 participants on this. So I know there are a number of people aligned on this. So think of somebody who would be good to go with to meet with that elected official. My experience has been most elected officials really aren't scary, and they really do want to hear what you think. I have been completely opposed. I've had to tell senators, we are going to come in and oppose your bill. I think you're wrong for X, Y, and Z reason, and we end in a pretty good spot. So I'd also say I think they aren't quite as intimidating, maybe again, as perception is. And just by virtue of you being involved in this group and you being on this call, you care enough and you know enough about the issues. You're ahead of a good number of elected officials on just their knowledge base. So I think don't be intimidated, I guess is what I would say. And you do have valuable information to share. Again, there are examples probably where elected officials don't care, but my experience has been in Nebraska in particular, they really do want to hear from you. And it's not as intimidating. Also, this panel, I'm sure amongst the 3 or the 4 of us would be happy to talk in more detail if there's somebody you're interested in talking to, or you are nervous about that process. And I'm at the Capitol every day during the legislative session. So if you see me, I'll be happy to help you out if I can.
Okay. Lucas, do you want to address specifically contacting federal officials, please, and then throw in any other comments you've got? And of course, you being a local appointed official may have a perspective to add as well.
Sure. So let me start with just echoing what Eric has been talking about. Everything that he said is spot on. I will add one type of contact to the comparison here, and that is no contact at all. And that's significantly worse than everything that he said. So, if you're in person or you're doing a phone call or a letter or an email, it doesn't matter. That's significantly better than not doing anything at all. So I want to encourage you to do that. I think Eric's completely right about just getting out there. Maybe give the office a call and see how you're treated, because invariably, when you call an office about an issue, they're going to treat you with respect. They're going to listen to what you have to say. They're going to write down what you have to say. It is amazingly easy to talk to officials. This is, Lori, you mentioned I'm an appointed official, and as an appointed official, I say, I encourage that with myself. So that's definitely, it's rare to have public engagement. And when it does happen, you pay attention to what those issues are. In terms of the, I wanted to say one more thing, which is that Citizens Climate Lobby has a phrase that I think is really appropriate here. It's that politicians don't create political will, the people do. And I completely wholeheartedly believe that. They definitely respond to political will. So they're always looking to get their fingers on the pulse of what their constituents are thinking, especially if you're a constituent, you're going to have their ear. In terms of contacting the federal members of Congress, it's actually not too different from contacting state or local people. There are addresses and phone numbers. Lori, I know you've been distributing those. And although I haven't talked to to Congressman Flood's office yet, because he's very new as a congressman, wait, that might not be true. I think I might have had one contact with him. But in any case, all of the offices in Nebraska, I agree with Eric, are very approachable. They want to hear what their constituents have to say. I'll talk a little bit more later about social media and engagement there, but really any of these forms is a good way to get in contact.
What about snail mail? I know there are some people who like to keep a stack of postcards, maybe already addressed, so they can fire off a postcard to somebody. Is that effective? What about, is there a difference between, say, sending them off to DC and, postcards that go somewhere in the state?
Absolutely. So it really depends on the particular individual. Some elected members are going to be more comfortable with email over snail mail. But the rule of thumb is that if it's handwritten, and you've gone to the effort to send something by snail mail, it's going to be read and it's going to be more well received. Just, getting in front of that person and having them actually read what you have to say is the goal with contacting. So I always recommend handwritten if possible. In terms of whether to send it to DC or the state, there's actually a little trick for federal representatives. If you send it to DC, it has to go through additional processing because it's going to the Capitol and they do all sorts of threat assessment on it. So it takes a little bit of extra time. I think they irradiate all the mail. It takes extra time to get to Congressperson's office. So if you send it to their local office, it avoids all of that delay. And there's a question Troy was asking about when you should send a bill or send a letter, contact your member of Congress or representative. And I think that that delay can be impactful. Troy was asking when the legislation should be, or when you should contact your senator after introduction for amendments. And my answer is anytime after introduction. You want to try and play things based on what's happening in Congress, right? If there's a big election coming up, maybe it's not the right time. If there's a big controversy, maybe it's not the right time. But other than that, if they're in recess, you might try and get an in-person meeting like a town hall or something like that. But other than that, I think most times are good times to contact your members of Congress.
Martha, anything you'd like to add to all this?
Yeah, I'll just echo some of the comments that were made. I think when you communicate one-on-one with these lawmakers, it's a very congenial, very different setting than what you might expect to see. If you're picturing somebody on the legislative floor or maybe in a more argumentative or combative mode, that's not at all the way it is. That's not my interactions with any of the lawmakers. So it's consider it a conversation, and it doesn't have to be this daunting thing that you can't approach these people. And also consider it a process as well. It's not, one engagement and then you back away and then you're done. It's everything is solved. You go back again and again. So just consider it a process. And just one more thing to add is become an elected official. You can talk to them, but also run if you have it in you to do so and be that change maker. Go for it and run and become one of them.
Eric, would you comment please on form letters or canned language used for an email? There are a lot of groups that send that around. If you're a member of a group, you've probably gotten some suggested language. So tell us just a little bit about how to use that kind of form.
Sure, Lori. So my preference is always the more you can personalize it, I think the more effective of an advocate you are. But some of the form letters do the best job of saying, why a piece of legislation is either really good or really bad. So even if you're gonna use that, I would say to make sure you put in some personalization to it, put in your story, why it's important to you or your family, somewhere within there. Again, I think I mentioned that a lot of offices do a count of, those who are for a piece of legislation, those who are opposed. Form letters kind of typically go in a different sort of stack. They still count it, but if there isn't personalization, it's not quite as effective, would be my take on it. With that said, sheer numbers do matter. So as Lucas said, any contact is better than no contact. So say you've had the longest day at work, there's a bill up on the floor tomorrow, you get home at 11:30 p.m. and that may be your only option. So if you're debating whether to not do that or to do it, I certainly would advocate to do that. Along the same lines, if you are able at the legislature, so say there's a bill, and again, that's kind of my bias or my view is that the Nebraska legislature. So I think Lucas and Martha probably have other, a broader array of experience. So, but I would encourage you, if you feel passionate about something, to show up and testify at at hearings. That is really impactful to senators. We're one of the only states where every bill gets a public hearing. And so I think that's one way to make your voice heard in the legislature. And I always encourage people to do that. It can be intimidating, but again, I think we've all hit on the fact that these elected officials really do care and want to hear from you. I will, Lori, if it's okay, and Troy, I'm not sure if your question was federal, state, or kind of all of the above. And I would agree with Lucas that, it really, the question is how soon before or after a piece of legislation is introduced should you contact the senator, including possible amendments to the bill. It looks like Troy is saying for all sort of forms of government. I would agree. As soon, if you like it, the sooner you want to tell a senator you think it's a good bill, you will be there to support it at a hearing. They like to hear that. Similarly, if you want a friendly amendment, again, the sooner you do that, the better chance you do have to get an amendment, as opposed to waiting until the Nebraska legislature, if it's on the second round of debate, you may be too late to do that. And then I would encourage you to, again, as Lucas said, to do it as many times as necessary. And so that's what the introducing senator. Candidly, there are some senators say they aren't on the committee where the bill is introduced. You may start talking to them in early January, and they're going to say, I have no clue what that bill is, whether I'll have to vote on that. So it's not a bad idea to contact them, but they may say, come back to me if this bill's on the floor, when I have more, I can have more focus on it. So I guess don't be offended if that's the message they're dealing with, 600 bills per year. And so I always say you can't expect them to know every single piece of information that's in every bill. So I'm probably all over the place on when the best time is, but that's my best answer, I guess, for now.
Okay, great. Thank you. So kind of related to that, just very briefly, if you're talking about one issue, maybe one bill, something that goes on for a while, do you express an opinion and then let it go? Or do you circle back a month or two later and say, here's how I feel about this? How much is too much, I guess, is the question.
Is that a question for me, Lori, or for anyone?
Sure. Yeah, just very briefly, and then we'll move on to the next issue.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think you can't again, and their inboxes are flooded. They're constantly meeting people, dealing with people. I tend to think you can't contact them enough. You can't tell them your perspective enough. I will say there's been one time that I remember I had a senator say, Eric, you've told me that 6 times now. If you tell me one more time, I'm actually going to change my position. So even if they do get to that position, usually they'll let you know that. So I think sometimes you can let them know, the better.
Okay. Thank you. So Eric, you'd mentioned testifying a minute or two ago, which is what we're going to move to next. So if you would talk just a little bit, please, about providing oral and written testimony, maybe first one and then the other. And I think it's probably going to apply to maybe not at the federal level, but for city council and for the state legislature. And I assume for boards like LES board as well. So if you would go over a few basics for that, please.
Sure. And can you hear me okay? For a second, it said my internet was, am I good? Okay, thank you.
I think we might have had to come in through a backdoor way to open this Zoom that's maybe a little less stable. So my apologies for that. But so far we're doing okay. So go ahead, Eric.
Okay, good. Just want to make sure. Again, I hate to be repetitive, but when you're looking at whether to provide in-person testimony or written testimony, you can probably guess what I'm going to say. In-person testimony, I think, is the most effective way to provide testimony. I would encourage you. So again, I'll deal with state legislature. A bill is introduced. I would encourage you as much as you can to be informed on the bill that you want to advocate for, you want to testify on, either for or against. Some of the bills can be very lengthy, you know, up to 100 pages in length and somewhat confusing. But others are very straightforward, you know, 1 to 2 pages, and it's very obvious what they're doing. But again, you're connected with the right people to help you interpret what the bill either says or is seeking to do. So I would encourage you to get informed on what the bill does. I think it's, you know, it all depends on the person. If you're going to prepare testimony, some people really like to go off of bullet points. Some people like to read from testimony or be prepared in that way. So really that's a personal preference. The more, again, personal it is, and, you know, as opposed to just reading off a piece of paper, I think that is more effective to elected officials. I do think written testimony is also important. It's also taken into account in the legislature. They typically read who all has sent a letter in and whether they're in support or opposition. And I do know committee members read through that. It's also in the legislature, if you aren't on that committee, oftentimes you're more likely to read the letters that were submitted than you are to be able to know what exactly was said at the hearing. So again, I encourage in-person testimony. And again, if you're able to talk with members of the committee ahead of time, I think you'll come in with a warmer reception. You will feel more comfortable when you're providing that testimony. Again, I know that comes down to time and kind of time and resources, but if you have time to meet with either the introducing senator or members of the committee, that you find a warmer reception. Along those same lines, if it's okay, Laura, I see there's a question from Carolyn Harp. I'll try to answer that may help with that, if that's okay. And the question is, if you want to speak with the state legislature, do you have to contact them before going? Do you need an app to speak to them, or can you just show up? So you just have to show up at the Nebraska State Capitol. It's one of the more accessible state capitals, I think, that there is across the country. There's a pretty easy process. You just go up to somebody who's they wear red coats, and you write a note to the senator you want to talk to. They walk it into the legislative floor, and typically the senator will come pretty quickly out to talk with you. So that process is fairly simple, or I think it's fairly simple, and senators, again, are likely to come out and talk with you. And so in that same vein, if you plan on testifying that afternoon, it's not a bad idea to come over that morning and speak with a few senators, again, if you're able, based on the time that you have. And I'll just say one more thing, is try to be somewhat unique in your testimony. Senators don't typically want to hear the same thing 25 times. So again, personalize it as much as you can, or if you have a different angle, then I think, you know, Martha, for example, when she comes in, has the data, the science behind it, as opposed to maybe what somebody else may bring as an economic argument. So as much as you can personalize it, make it unique, that also is helpful for senators.
Thank you. Lucas, additional comments on that?
Yeah, so just 2 additional comments. One is, as we continue forward with technological innovation, I think you're going to see this more and more, but there are boards out there, for example, LES, that allow you to testify virtually. We broadcast our board meetings, and you are allowed to log in and make public comments in that form. So I encourage that if there's a particular issue, especially at the state and local level, you can find out whether that particular, public power district, or whether the Natural Resources Board or what have you have virtual testimony as an option. And the other thing that I wanted to say was that I completely agree with Eric in terms of personalization, but I also want to say that, I'm speaking personally, and I think that this is true in general. The most important thing is that you're authentic and that you're true to yourself. Don't worry if you're nervous. It's okay to be nervous. It can be intimidating, especially the first time you're going in front of a public official. One of the things that I think that many public officials embrace is trying to make people comfortable expressing their point of view. It's okay if you're nervous. The most important thing, in my opinion, is that you are authentic. You know, if you can make an economic argument, or if you can, you know, if you can take Martha's climate data and defend your position that way, great. But if you convey how you're feeling to me, that's the thing that I want to hear.
Martha, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, these are great points. Just a few things to follow on for this. If you are intimidated, then go, you know, watch it and not testify. Just see how the process goes, and you know, so you can kind of look at a run through almost. Be cognizant there is a time limit. So, and that can depend on how many show up to testify in person. So just be aware of that, because I think the senators don't particularly like when people go on and are not aware of that time limitation. So just something to be cognizant of. Be specific in your comments, as specific as you can. Let's see. Another comment, there also might be coordination of testimony on certain bills. It may not happen all the time, but Citizens Climate Lobby or Sierra Club, or even a staffer that works for one of the senators, could coordinate testimonies. And so you'll know maybe an order to go in, or what other people are providing as testimony. So that does happen sometimes. So just some other things to be aware of.
You know, one thing I'll mention from the legislature, I was going to echo Martha's comment about, if you've never seen this before, or for the city council, just watch it, and you can watch both those streaming online, and that'll give you a really good feel for how the process works. And it really does. It's still going to be scary, but you know, at least you'll know what the situation is. So just one last thing, really quickly. Generally, at least in my experience, if you're just a member of the public who shows up and you're a concerned citizen or whatever, you're and you are respectful and succinct and so forth, you're treated courteously. But occasionally there'll be a senator who maybe will ask you a question that seems very defensive because it's not in line with their position or whatever. How do you handle that if something like that happens to you? What's your response? Any of the three of you? Eric, looks like Lucas has got his mic off. Go ahead, Lucas.
I was just going to say, you know, if there's ever a question, even if it's not antagonistic, if there's a question that you don't know the answer to, a great answer is, you know, that's a good question. I'll get back to you. And you don't feel like you have to answer on the spot. You can then follow up. In fact, that's a good thing to do. Once you've given public testimony, follow up in written communication to, you know, make sure that you state the points that you wanted to make, or you're covering whatever the question happened to be. So that's one way to do it. I don't know. I think that's pretty rare, especially for a member of the public, for an elected official to grill you. You know, they might do that to their colleagues, but I don't think that's very common. If it is, I don't know. My personal advice is to keep your cool and treat them with respect, because if you're not going to convince the person who's grilling you, and by the way, I'm not conceding that that's true, but if you're not going to convince the person who's grilling you, you're going to be talking to the other people in the room. And you want to make your position look as professional as you can. So that's my short advice.
Okay, very good. Thank you. And Lucas, let's stick with you. Move on to our next topic, which is media, both traditional and social media. So if you would talk a little bit about letters to the editor or things you might post on social media and so forth, that'd be great.
Sure. So this is one of many ways of, you know, now that we're in the technical age, social media lets us communicate with our representatives very easily. You know, there are multiple platforms out there. Which platform politicians pay attention to can vary from politician to politician. How important social media is versus traditional media is going to be very specific. You might, for example, have heard stories about Senator Sass, former Senator Sass, and is that today? Is that it's sometime very, very near now. The 5th, it was a big fan of Twitter, for example. That was a good way to communicate with him. You want to respect the format that is there, but use hashtags appropriately. Keep your message short and sweet when you're using social media. I personally am a big fan of written media that includes letters to the editor or op-eds. The Journal Star, just like many politicians, wants to hear from you. They are always looking for content for the editorial page. I think, in fact, it was in the last week, they made their annual plea. Please write letters to the editor. Tell us what you think. Tell us your opinions and why you think them. And if you are really ambitious, you can write a full-length op-ed. They're called Local Views in the Journal Star. But these are really good ways to keep the discussion going in the public sphere, and especially elected representatives. Not everybody reads the opinion page, but elected representatives are going to read the opinion page.
If you want to do a letter to the editor or a guest column, does it matter? And does it matter if you pick the World Herald or the Journal Star, or any advice on that?
I think that I say Journal Star because I'm assuming that many people in the audience are from Lincoln, but especially if you have ties to a different community, I think it's very appropriate to send to other locations. If your family grew up farming, in outside of Kearney or something, you might consider sending it to the local paper there and talking about that connection, especially if you have some connection in your letter or in your op-ed. That's a really good way of having that voice be heard. I think that the story there is the same as with the Journal Star or the Omaha World Herald. Maybe not, the Washington Post or the New York Times or something like this, but they're always looking for content. They're always looking for people to write letters to the editor so that they can have things to publish. That's part of their job. So yeah, I strongly encourage thinking about going elsewhere. And once you've had a letter to the editor published, you might also think about shopping that around. Say you have a connection in Kearney and you want to send it to the World Herald. Feel free to do that. You can have the same letter published multiple times as long as you're upfront about it. You don't want to send the same letter to multiple newspapers without telling them, because you want it to appear in one place kind of with priority. But besides that, send it as many as you're comfortable.
Eric, anything you'd like to add to that?
I don't have a whole lot. Lucas did a really nice job. This is probably obvious, but if you're in terms of which paper, which publication to decide, if you're advocating to LES, obviously I think the Lincoln Journal Star is probably the most appropriate, or if it's OPPD, even if you live in Lincoln, think about where the decision is most impactful. The only other thing I'd say is, again, before testifying or advocating with senators, as much as you can, try to read what's in the news. Again, in the lobby, we try to make sure we're informed on the news, because it's kind of embarrassing if I'm advocating to a senator and they said, well, didn't you read the article this morning? I said, I'm absolutely opposed. And now you're talking to me like you have no clue that. So that's maybe too lobby specific, but as much as you can, try to read up on local politics, and maybe, who supports and who opposes, if there are articles or op-eds, and that can be helpful as you're advocating for a certain position too. So as much as, and again, with this group, spending your Tuesday night doing this, I take it we're talking to a very informed group, but I'd encourage you to read as much as you can on that.
Thank you. Martha, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I guess I would just say stick to maybe or focus on the benefits of a particular action or bill. Stick to the pros as opposed to the cons. A lot of people they want hope and something to look forward to, and so kind of focusing on the positive side rather than the negative could get more people to buy in and more interaction.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Martha, if you would like to move us into our next topic, I think we all think of Martha as a scientist and climatologist, but she also has a lot of experience and advice on effectively communicating on issues that you care about. And obviously a lot of her experience and expertise is climate change. And but I think the same suggestions are going, as with everything we've talked about tonight, are going to apply to other topics as well. So Martha, give us some tips for better communication.
Yeah, well, I guess in my family, I have the advantage of being the climate scientist, and so all the weather and climate questions tend to come toward me. But I think about the Yale Project on Climate Communication. They survey the U.S. population every year about our perceptions and attitudes on climate change and climate action and belief and so forth. And the map that I think of the most is that when we ask the U.S. population, and including Nebraska, how do we feel, or do we talk about climate change? And 35% of Nebraskans say yes, they do talk about it. So that means most of Nebraskans don't, and most of the U.S. population does not talk about it. So it can be a very difficult subject to talk about, and something that I think of, and this approach that I use, if I know that I'm going to be communicating with somebody who feels differently than I do, maybe is a science denier or doesn't understand climate change. So I think of myself on one side of the bridge and they are on the other side of the bridge. And I could say, hey, come over here. I want to talk about climate change. That's probably not going to bring them over across that bridge. So I have to physically, or in theory, go over to the other side of the bridge and communicate with them on something that they care about. Again, it could be our children, it could be their health, it could be water, it could be the wildfires, it could be this weather that we're having, or where we get our energy comes from, water and so forth. So start the discussion with something that isn't controversial, and something that you can talk about. If you can't talk about climate, then find something that you can talk about and then relate it back to whatever issue is that you really want to focus on. So you're gradually kind of leading that person across the bridge and over to maybe the viewpoint that you have. So that's kind of one strategy that I use if somebody is way on the other side of where I feel or where the science is, and it may be difficult to even just start the conversation. So that's one tactic I use. I often actually get away from facts and figures and fancy charts and data because a lot of people just don't understand it, or they don't connect to that, or they're not moved or inspired by that. So I like to maybe tell stories to get people to relate to each other. And, this could work with friends and family, or even, we talked about testimonies earlier. This could work in your testimony, sharing a story that is local and relevant and specifically addresses a certain issue that you want to communicate around. So those are some of the tactics I use when talking with people that I know, and I know they feel very differently than I do. And I guess I would also say something I mentioned earlier is consider this a process. You're not, unfortunately, going to change somebody's mind probably with one conversation. It's going to take time and going back to them over and over. So unfortunately, it's not a one and done. It is a process. But those are some things that I think about and use.
Martha, I believe I've seen some statistics or some information on the difference it can make to even have these conversations. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I guess I'll relate it to, so I was involved in a project working with municipalities, cities across Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, and Missouri. And we created these climate information reports that were local to the specific municipalities. And we worked with these cities over time, and these reports included, scientific information and data and implications of climate change. And we went back to these cities a few years after they had these reports, and we said, what was the value in them? What good did it do? How did you use this information? And some of the cities said it was the basis for having a conversation. So it was the infographic, kind of the material that we could use in our city council meeting to have a conversation on climate. And so just there's a lot of value in just starting this conversation. So it's just a little story that illustrates this idea of just starting that conversation somehow can be really impactful. I've also read some studies that say if you are in a youth age group, let's say you're high school or college age, and you talk to your parents or relatives that are skeptical of climate change, these younger people are the most likely group to change their parents or relatives' mindset. So having it come from somebody who they already trust and know as the source of information, that changes people's minds. So just a couple of examples of how this is really valuable. It's very meaningful. I tell people the best thing we can do to combat climate change is to talk about it. Everybody can have a conversation about climate in some form. If you can't start with climate, start with the weather, because nobody is a weather denier. We all are impacted by weather events. So you can start there if you don't know where else to start.
Seems like a good New Year's resolution to have a regular climate conversation. So, Eric, anything you'd like to add?
I don't have a whole, and anything I would say is agreeing with Martha, or probably just expanding on a point. Ken Winston had asked if I would share tips, and so I tried to do that in the chat, and I can share that with Lori later for others to see. One of those is to advocate, don't agitate, and I use that for elected officials, but that's true with family and friends too. And I think that's the point Martha was making when you start on opposite ends of the bridge. I always say in the lobby, I've never seen a senator change their mind after being screamed at on something, and that's true for friends and family. And so that's one of the phrases I like to use, is to advocate, don't agitate. And another one you hear is that there's more that unites us than divides us. And I think that's another point Martha's trying to was saying is, find those uniting either words or uniting issues, and you're much more likely to get a receptive audience, whether it's friends, family, or elected officials.
Lucas, anything to add?
Yeah, so these are all great points. Continuing along those lines, that we have more in common than not. There's a few issues you might think about when talking to this skeptical family member. Many people, 80% of the American population supports solar power, or many people are interested in electric vehicles, or in saving money on heating expenses, heating and cooling, heat pumps. There are fantastic economical technology. There are many ways that you can use these technologies as those bridges that Martha's talking about, where you're both going to agree on the approach. The other thing that I wanted to mention is, one thing that causes people to not talk about climate change with family or friends or elected officials is this perception that the other side, and especially if you're talking about the other political side of the political divide, doesn't see things the same way that I do. And especially on climate change, this is much more perception than it is reality. People are significantly more likely to think that the person that they're talking to opposes, decarbonization, or going green, or reducing emissions, or cleaning up the environment. Most people are not going to oppose cleaning up the environment or reducing emissions. They might have some concerns around economics, but that's something to talk about. That's not starting from opposite positions. If you look at the results, if you look at the polls, people are much more skeptical of other people's opinions than other people are. So you can poll both the people about other people and the other people themselves. And so that skepticism is it's good to know that you're probably not going to be talking to someone who actually disagrees with you, especially if you're looking for that common ground like Martha's talking about.
Okay, very good. Thank you. I want to give a chance for Brian Hermsen to weigh in. He, in addition to excellent technical skills, also has a lot of experience with these issues as well. So Brian, anything you'd like to comment on any of our topics?
No, I feel like you guys gave a very good overview of the points that I think about. I would just say that I have also been struck by those polls that a big part of not talking about, in this case, climate, really is that perception, and that it's sort of self-reinforcing, is that you have this sense that there's way more opposition or way more disagreement than there actually is, and that just keeps people from talking about it. And so really, very simply, having those discussions is a big way to combat that.
And Brian, do you are there questions in the chat that we can get to that? I know you've been following that. I did see a comment by Susan Smith mentioning Catherine Hayhoe's book as Martha was talking. That was our read from, let's see, was it two polls ago? And which is a wonderful discussion of having respectful conversations. And she's talking about climate, but again, her suggestions would apply to probably any topic. The title of the book is Saving Us, and then it has a long subtitle that I don't remember, but Catherine Hayhoe, and I think we all recommend that book. So, Brian, anything we can address here?
Sure. Kay asked a question a while back, and this was to Martha. Do you recommend sources on climate science for the general public?
Yeah, probably the primary source would be, if you're interested in the science of climate change and adaptation and mitigation, there's something called the U.S. National Climate Assessment. They have a publication that comes out about every 5 years. The most recent one was from 2018. There are some Nebraska specific information in there. There's also regional specific as well as sectoral chapters in that, and it's written more in plain language, so it's intended for a broader audience. So I can put a link to that here in the chat box, but that's one that I would recommend. And after that came out, the State Climate Office did produce a Nebraska key messages from that U.S. National Climate Assessment. So I can send a link to that as well. The next U.S. National Climate Assessment should be coming out later this year, so you can be on the lookout for that. That's also some good material if you are providing testimony or want some basic scientific information to speak with an elected official about, then that's also a good, simple source of information.
Okay, very good. More questions, Brian?
Let's see here.
I know we answered a few as we were going along, actually.
We have a question from Susan Smith saying, we haven't touched yet on faith being an important point that could be brought up as a reason for advocacy. And didn't know, Lori, if you wanted to touch on that.
You know, I guess I would say this, and maybe one of our panelists or Brian will have additional comments. I think it can be effective to explain what viewpoint that you come from on your testimony. And maybe you come at something as a parent, or maybe you come at something as a business owner. And for the climate action team at First-Plymouth, and I know there are a number of other faith-based climate and other groups. I know Bread for the World, for example, their members are planning to attend. If that's your perspective, I think it can be effective to say that as a person of faith, you think this is an important issue because, and then fill in the blank. And so I think that can be very powerful if you're authentic about it, as several of you have mentioned. Any other comments on that from our panelists? Brian?
No, I think that's a good point. And I think this has been mentioned earlier, but the more that you can really approach your discussions with elected officials with sincerity and from your own personal standpoint, and being authentic, being sincere, I think is the most important thing.
Okay, other questions in the chat, Brian?
Lori, if it's okay, I was just going to add, I think it was a good point. Susan, I think, asked the question or put that in there. The reality is, especially in Nebraska or everywhere, a lot of elected officials are very connected to their church, and will perk up when they hear that, you know, your faith is the reason or compelled you to be there, or, you know, if you can personalize it related to your faith or the church you belong to. I think it certainly is an effective way to advocate. And I've seen it, you know, I've seen senators who aren't paying as close attention, then they kind of perk up when they hear that sort of perspective.
Are there situations, Eric, where that doesn't work well because we know different faith communities see different things differently?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is, you know, there are certain senators who may not be as, you know, that may not mean as much to them. But I haven't seen a senator be completely dismissive or think that, you know, if your faith is personal to you, that it, you know, I haven't seen them completely dismiss it. And then I was going to, Lucas did a nice job earlier talking about if a senator is being, or I keep saying senator, but an elected official is being combative with you, ways to prevent that. And I saw Ken Winston say he's seen instances where that has happened. I don't think it happens often, but I would just say if it really is getting to a point where it's combative, I think it's effective to say, it sounds like we may disagree on this point. I'm happy to send you follow-up information, and maybe we can meet separately or meet after this hearing to talk about it. So it's not in such a combative kind of public forum. And usually once you've said that, it's rare that an elected official will keep, you know, will kind of keep going at the point. So sorry, that was not responsive to the question, but it was just something I saw in the chat.
Well, you've actually anticipated the last thing I was going to ask, is if any of the three of you have any final words of wisdom you'd like to impart. I see our time is up. So, Martha?
Yeah, so we focused on elected officials, but there's also a staff. So, you know, there's chief of staff, and especially at the federal level and state level as well. But there are staffers who concentrate on specific issues, and so it's worth it to do your research and connect with one of the staff members as well. That's typically who you'll interact with, or that's who I've interacted with in the past. So think of it as a team in addition to the elected official.
Good point. Thank you. Lucas?
Yeah, so I guess my final thought would be I'm going to give another shout out to Environmental Voter Project. They're a great organization, and they're always looking for people to volunteer. But they have a phrase, when environmentalists don't vote, politicians don't listen. I think that's very true. I think that most of the people on this call are voters, but I think you can extend that and go one step beyond. When environmentalists don't speak, when environmentalists don't contact their members of Congress or politicians or elected officials of any stripe, then they aren't able to listen. So you can't have a conversation if one side isn't there. So I encourage you all to get involved and stay involved.
Thank you. Eric?
I feel like I kind of got my last word in. Sorry if I jumped again, but I would just say to be engaged. And again, you know, by you being on this Zoom, I think you already are engaged. And I'll just make the point one last time. Elected officials really do care what your perspective is, and especially on climate related issues. I think your voice does matter. So that would be thanks for including all of us and letting us do this tonight.
Very good. Well, thank you to the three of you and to Brian for his help for a very interesting, informative hour. We really appreciate it. The recording of this presentation will be posted in the next few days on the same webpage you've used to access the Zoom account for tonight's talk, so the Climate Action Team page. And you'll also find recordings of previous presentations or links to those presentations on the same site. I'd especially like to draw your attention to our November 3rd presentation on how electricity is generated in Nebraska, particularly by LES. Despite the fact that we have some of the most reliable and least expensive electricity in the country, we expect to see efforts in the legislature this year to make electric utilities a little more political and probably a little less responsive to local customers. If you watch the November 3rd program, you'll be prepared to weigh in on this discussion if you'd like to. We hope you're all feeling inspired and prepared to participate in the public policy issues facing our community and our state and our country. Please remember that every voice matters and that action leads to hope. So thank you all again, and have a good evening.